Have you ever spent hours preparing a holiday for the people you love, only to realize they no longer saw you as the one who made it possible? Have you ever walked into your own dining room and suddenly felt like you were the guest instead of the host? And what would you do if someone smiled, looked you in the eye, and told you to learn the rules inside the home you'd spent decades building? Christmas had always started early in my house. That morning, like every Christmas morning for the past 32 years, my alarm rang at 4:30. The house was still dark, the neighborhood completely silent, and for a few precious minutes it felt exactly the way it always had. I tied on the same faded apron I'd worn every Christmas since my husband was alive and quietly started making coffee before anyone else woke up. The turkey was already seasoned from the night before. Homemade cinnamon rolls were rising beneath a clean towel, and my husband's favorite serving platter sat exactly where it always had. Even though he'd been gone for 6 years, I still placed it on the table every Christmas. Somehow, it made the house feel complete. By 7 o'clock, the smell of breakfast filled every room. By 8, I was polishing glasses, folding napkins, and setting the dining table exactly the way my husband and I always had. His chair remained at the head of the table until the very last minute. No one sat there anymore, but moving it before everyone arrived never felt right. Around 10 o'clock, the first cars pulled into the driveway. My son carried wrapped presents inside while my grandchildren raced through the front door laughing. My daughter-in-law followed behind them, carrying 2 grocery bags, and disappeared into the kitchen to help. At first, nothing felt unusual. She asked where I wanted the desserts and helped arrange a few serving dishes. Then little things began changing. She quietly moved 2 place settings. She switched the children's seats because she thought it would make things less chaotic. My sister-in-law walked in holding a bowl of mashed potatoes, looked past me and asked, "Where would you like this?" Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law smiled and pointed toward the counter. A few minutes later, one of my granddaughters ran into the dining room carrying a stack of napkins. "Grandma Sarah," she called to my daughter-in-law, "where do these go?" Again, I opened my mouth to answer and stopped. None of them meant to hurt me. That was what made it sting. Without anyone saying it out loud, the room had quietly started looking to someone else for decisions that had always been mine. I stayed silent. It was Christmas, and I refused to believe a few small changes mattered more than having my family together. By early afternoon, dinner was finally ready. I carried the last serving bowl into the dining room and looked proudly at the table I'd spent nearly 8 hours preparing. Candles flickered softly. The good china reflected the lights from the Christmas tree. My eyes instinctively drifted toward the head of the table, where my husband's chair had always been. It was exactly where I'd left it. Then I looked for my own chair. It wasn't there. At first, I assumed someone had moved it by mistake while carrying food into the room. I glanced around, expecting to spot it nearby. I didn't. My chair had been moved halfway down the table. Before I could ask why, my daughter-in-law smiled pleasantly and said, "Oh, we changed the seating this year. It'll work much better for everyone." As I lifted my plate, it suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Without saying a word, I walked toward my usual chair and reached for it. That's when my daughter-in-law looked directly at me, smiled calmly, and said, "Maybe you should learn the rules again. For 68 years, No one had ever told me how to behave inside my own home. No one laughed. No one defended me. They simply waited to see what I would do next. For several long seconds, no one said a word. The Christmas music was still playing softly in the background, but somehow the silence felt even louder. My daughter-in-law's smile faded, just enough to show she hadn't expected me to stop. She'd expected me to quietly accept the new seating arrangement. Instead, I kept one hand resting on the back of my chair and looked around the table. Every face seemed to be waiting for someone else to say something first. Finally, my daughter-in-law cleared her throat. "Mom," she said gently, "we just thought we'd organize things a little differently this year." I looked at her without moving. "Organize what?" She smiled again, though it looked more forced this time. "The seating. The kids are older now. Everyone has different conversations, and this just makes more sense." I glanced down at the place card sitting where my chair used to be. My own name had been moved halfway down the table, while my daughter-in-law now sat beside my son's place near the head of the table. I looked back at her. "Who decided that?" Before she could answer, her mother spoke up with a light laugh. "Oh, we all thought it would make things easier." Easier. The word lingered in my mind. Easier for whom? My eyes slowly traveled around the room. The centerpiece I'd arranged that morning had been replaced. My husband's favorite carving knife had already been laid beside someone else's plate. A serving spoon rested on the table runner my mother had embroidered by hand over 40 years earlier. It no longer felt like I was looking at my Christmas dinner. It felt as though I'd walked into someone else's tradition. My daughter-in-law noticed where I was looking. "It's just a few little changes," she said. "Nobody's hurting anything." I met her eyes. "You moved my seat." She shrugged lightly. "It's only a chair." I looked towards the empty chair that had belonged to my husband for more than 30 Christmases. Then I looked back at mine. "No," I said quietly. "It isn't." The room fell silent again. My son finally stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom?" "I wasn't expecting you to be upset." He wasn't surprised by the new seating. He was surprised that I wasn't quietly accepting it. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to explain, then glanced around at everyone else before looking back at me. "Mom, let's not do this in front of everyone." That hurt more than I expected. If this had truly been a misunderstanding, he would have been asking the same questions I was. Instead, he was asking me to make everyone else comfortable. My daughter-in-law stepped closer, lowering her voice as though she were being reasonable. "Mom, it's not like anyone was trying to replace you. We just thought it was time to start doing things a little differently." My eyes drifted around the dining room, the walls my husband had painted himself, the table where we'd celebrated 32 Christmas dinners together, the home where every tradition in that room had begun because we'd built it together. Then I looked back at everyone, waiting for my answer. "Different," I repeated softly. "Is that what you think this is?" No one answered, because there wasn't an answer that didn't make the truth sound even worse. I slowly set my plate back on the table. Then, without another word, I turned away from the dining room and walked toward my home office. Behind me, I heard confused whispers. Someone quietly asked where I was going. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed me. They all assumed I needed a moment to calm down. They had no idea I wasn't walking away from the argument. I was walking towards something that would change the rest of Christmas. And none of them were ready for what I was about to bring back. I could still hear quiet voices behind me as I walked down the hallway. No one tried to stop me. They were too busy convincing themselves I simply needed a few minutes to cool off. Inside my home office, I opened the bottom drawer of the old oak filing cabinet my husband had bought nearly 20 years earlier. Everything was exactly where I'd left it: insurance papers, tax records, my will, and beneath them a dark blue folder with one simple label across the front: property deed. I rested my hand on it for a moment before picking it up. My husband and I had signed those papers decades earlier, back when that house was little more than an empty lot and a dream we could barely afford. We hadn't built a mansion. We'd built a home. Every Christmas, every birthday, every family dinner had happened because we had opened that front door, not because anyone else had ever owned the right to walk through it. Taking a slow breath, I closed the drawer and walked back towards the dining room. The conversation stopped the second I appeared. Every pair of eyes followed the blue folder in my hands. My daughter-in-law frowned slightly. "Mom, what's that?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I placed the folder carefully on the dining table between the serving dishes and quietly opened it. The room was so silent I could hear the Christmas music playing faintly from the living room. I slid one sheet of paper across the table toward my son. "Read the first line." He looked confused but picked it up anyway. His eyes moved across the page before the color slowly drained from his face. "Mom," he whispered. I looked at him calmly. "Go ahead." His voice was barely audible. "Owner." He stopped, swallowed hard, then continued. "Margaret Collins." He looked up at me. Only Margaret Collins. No one else spoke. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, trying to see the document from where she stood. "I don't understand," she said. I looked at her. "The house has never belonged to anyone except me." She blinked in surprise. "But we're family." "Yes," I replied. "You are." I gently closed the folder, which is exactly why none of you ever needed permission to come here for Christmas. My son stared down at the deed without saying a word. "Every birthday party," I continued quietly, "every Thanksgiving, every Christmas morning, every barbecue in the backyard, every memory you've made inside these walls happened because I invited you here." I let that settle before adding, "An invitation is not the same thing as ownership." My daughter-in-law folded her arms. "Nobody said we owned the house." I held her gaze. Then why was I the only person at this table who wasn't allowed to decide where I could sit? She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Her mother quietly looked down at her plate. My son still hadn't lifted his eyes from the deed. Finally, he whispered, "Mom, I never thought of it that way." I nodded slowly. That's exactly what frightens me. For a long moment, nobody moved. The turkey grew cold. The candles continued burning. Somewhere in the living room, one of my grandsons laughed at something on television, completely unaware that the adults in the next room had forgotten the difference between being welcomed into a home and believing they had a right to it. Then I did something none of them expected. I carefully closed the folder, picked it up, and looked directly at my son. "Dinner can wait," I said quietly. "First, we're going to have a very different conversation." And for the first time all afternoon, it wasn't my daughter-in-law deciding what happened next. No one moved. For several long seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint Christmas music drifting in from the living room. My son was still staring at the deed in front of him as though reading it again might somehow change the words. It didn't. I closed the folder and looked around the table one last time. Would everyone excuse us for a little while? I asked quietly. Nobody argued. One by one, the relatives stood, gathering children and half-filled coffee cups before slowly disappearing into the living room. Within a minute, the dining room that had been so full only moments earlier felt strangely empty. Only my son, my daughter-in-law, and I remained. For a while, none of us spoke. My son finally reached for his coffee, then stopped before taking a sip. His hand trembled slightly as he set the cup back down. He looked exhausted, like someone who had spent the last 10 minutes realizing his memory of the afternoon wasn't the same as everyone else's. Finally, he broke the silence. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal. His voice barely carried across the table. The seating, the decorations, the little changes. Every year there seemed to be one more thing. I always thought it was easier not to argue. He looked at the deed again before quietly continuing. Then one day, it stopped feeling like we were borrowing your home for Christmas. I let us start acting as though it belonged to all of us. He swallowed hard. I don't even know when that happened. I just know somewhere along the way, I stopped asking you. I let his words settle between us before speaking. Do you know why your father always insisted on leaving those 2 chairs exactly where they were? My son slowly shook his head. I looked toward the head of the table. Because your father always said, if you respect a home, it'll always welcome you back. My eyes rested on my husband's empty chair for a moment. The chairs were never important. Then I looked at the place where mine had been moved. But respect always was. My son lowered his head into his hands. I don't think Dad would have recognized the way I handled today. That sentence hurt him far more than anything I could have said. He had spent his whole life trying to become the kind of man his father had been. In a single afternoon, he realized how far he'd drifted from the values he had been raised with. Beside him, my daughter-in-law quietly removed the place card that had been sitting beside my son's chair. She turned it over in her hands without looking at either of us. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. When I planned the seating, I honestly thought I was helping. She gave a small, embarrassed smile that disappeared almost immediately. Then everyone kept asking me where things should go. And I liked it. She looked down at the card in her hands. I didn't even realize I'd started making decisions that were never mine to make. She carefully placed the place card back on the table. I thought I was organizing Christmas. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I never realized I was slowly pushing you out of it. Silence settled over the room again. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence from earlier. It was the kind that only comes when excuses have finally run out. My son slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the house key I'd given him years earlier for emergencies. He placed it gently on the table between us. Neither of us reached for it. We simply looked at it. After several quiet moments, I slid it back toward him. He looked up, confused. Keep it, I said softly. It doesn't open anything anymore. His eyes filled with tears as he understood what I meant. The locks could always be changed. Trust was harder to repair. We simply sat there, saying nothing, while the little brass key rested between us. Hours earlier, it had been nothing more than a spare key. Now it rested between us like a quiet reminder that a door can always be unlocked, but trust has to be invited back inside. The conversation lasted much longer than any of us expected. By the time we walked back into the living room, the children had already finished opening presents. Christmas music was playing softly again, and every conversation stopped the moment the family saw us. No one asked what had been said. They didn't need to. Something had changed, and everyone could see it. My son walked into the dining room first. Without saying a word, he picked up my chair and carried it back to the place where it had stood every Christmas for more than 30 years. Then he quietly moved his own chair beside his wife's, farther down the table. He didn't ask anyone what they thought. He simply put things back where they had always belonged. The room stayed silent. A few moments later, my daughter-in-law slowly walked toward me. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't seem interested in defending herself. She looked nervous, ashamed. She took a slow breath before speaking. "There's something I need to say." Every eye in the room turned toward her. She looked around at the family before finally meeting my eyes. The day I decided to change the seating, I told myself I was only trying to organize dinner. She paused, struggling to continue. I never stopped to ask whether I had the right to change a tradition that was never mine to change. Her voice grew quieter. "I wasn't trying to take your seat." She glanced towards the chair my son had just returned to its proper place. "But I can see now." I slowly started taking something much bigger than a chair. She swallowed hard before continuing. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing your traditions as gifts and started treating them like they belonged to me." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry. Not because today became uncomfortable, but because I forgot whose home had been welcoming all of us every Christmas for all these years." No one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was respectful. I walked over and gently placed my hand over hers. "An apology matters," I said softly. "But what matters even more is what we choose to do after it." She nodded quietly. That Christmas dinner finally began almost an hour later than we had planned. The turkey wasn't as hot as it should have been. The gravy needed warming again. Some of the rolls had gone cold. Yet somehow it became one of the best Christmas dinners our family had ever shared. Not because everything had gone perfectly, but because everyone finally understood what truly belonged at the head of the table. In the months that followed, the changes weren't dramatic. They were quiet. My son stopped assuming permission where an invitation had been given. My daughter-in-law started asking instead of deciding. The spare key stayed in my son's pocket, but neither of them ever used it again without calling first. Trust didn't return overnight. It returned one respectful choice at a time. The following Christmas, I woke up at 4:30 once again. As I walked into the dining room, I smiled before anyone else arrived. My chair was exactly where it had always been. Beside it sat my husband's empty chair, waiting quietly as it always had. A little while later, the front door opened, and one by one, my family began arriving. My daughter-in-law stepped inside carrying dessert. She paused beside the table, looked at me, and smiled. "Where would you like everything this year?" It was such a simple question. A year earlier, she would have answered that question herself. Now she waited for me. I smiled and pointed toward the kitchen. "Right where they've always gone." She nodded, and without another word, she carried the dishes exactly where I'd asked. In that quiet moment, I realized something my husband had understood all along. A family isn't held together by traditions, it's held together by respect. Traditions can change, respect never should. As I watched my children, my grandchildren, and the home we'd spent a lifetime building fill with laughter once again, my eyes drifted toward the little brass key resting quietly in my son's pocket. It could still unlock my front door, but we all understood something we'd forgotten for a little while. A key may unlock a front door, but only respect earns the privilege of being welcomed inside